Cleopatra did not die the way you think she did. No grand speech, no dramatic stare at a snake, no quiet, noble ending that paintings and movies love to show you. Instead, her final days were confusing, awkward, and honestly a little ridiculous. What really happened inside that locked tomb? Why did one of Rome's greatest generals accidentally start his own death because of a rumor? And how did a simple locked door turn into one of the most absurd chain reactions in ancient history? Here's the real story, and it is far funnier than any textbook will ever admit. If you enjoy history that actually surprises you, hit subscribe and like this video, because what you are about to hear will completely change how you see Cleopatra forever. Let us begin. Cleopatra did not simply walk into her mausoleum one day and lock the doors behind her. That would have been too simple, too direct, and far too dignified for what actually happened. No, the Queen of Egypt spent days planning this move with the same careful strategy she had used to charm Julius Caesar and negotiate with Mark Antony. She understood something that most of her advisors refused to admit. The walls were closing in. Octavian's armies were marching closer every single morning, and the only leverage she had left was herself and her treasure. So she began moving things. Gold first, then silver, then jewels, then stacks of documents and royal records that prove her dynasty had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries. Servants carried armloads of wealth through palace corridors while guards looked the other way. The mausoleum that was supposed to be her final resting place slowly transformed into something else entirely. It became a fortress, a vault, and a stage. Cleopatra was not just preparing to die. She was preparing to negotiate from absolute safety. Imagine being one of her attendants during those final days. You wake up not knowing if Octavian has already entered the city. You hear rumors that Roman soldiers have been seen at the eastern gates. You watch your queen as she dresses carefully, eats lightly, and gives orders with the same calm voice she has always used. But now there is something different in her eyes. Not fear. Not desperation, something closer to amusement, as if she already knows exactly how this story will end, and she is the only one who truly understands a joke. The night before she sealed herself inside, she reportedly spent hours with her most trusted companions. Ancient writers hint at conversations that were never fully recorded. Whispers about what Octavian truly wanted from her. Speculation about whether he would keep her alive as a trophy or quietly remove her once the treasure was secured. And something else, something that historians have always danced around. The unspoken question of what a young Roman conqueror might demand from a captured queen behind closed doors. Cleopatra knew the rumors. She knew what victors sometimes did to the women they defeated. And she knew that Octavian was not Mark Antony. He felt no loyalty to her, no affection. No late-night conversations filled with whispered promises. He saw her as an asset, and assets can be used in many ways. That knowledge changed everything. Her decision to enter the mausoleum was not just about protecting treasure. It was about protecting herself from a fate worse than death. A fate where she would be paraded through Rome chained and humiliated while crowds laughed at the fallen queen. A fate where she might be displayed in Octavian's triumph like an exotic animal. A fate where her children would be taken from her and her body would no longer belong to herself. She would become a symbol, not a person. And for a woman who had ruled as a living goddess, that was unacceptable. So she made her move. On the day she entered the mausoleum, she did not say goodbye to anyone outside her inner circle. She simply walked through the great stone doors, and then she had them sealed from the inside. The sound of locking mechanisms echoed through the courtyard. Guard stationed outside heard the heavy bolts slide into place. And just like that, the Queen of Egypt disappeared from the world. She was still alive, but to everyone watching from the palace windows, she might as well have already been dead. Inside the mausoleum, the atmosphere was strange. Treasure piled high against the walls. Oil lamps flickering in the dim stone chambers. A handful of attendants, moving quietly, trying not to disturb whatever plan their queen was silently executing. Cleopatra reportedly sat among her riches, not touching them, just looking at them. Gold that had belonged to her ancestors. jewels that had been traded for grain during famines, documents that proved her family had ruled for generations. All of it now trapped inside a tomb with her. And somewhere outside that sealed door Mark Antony was about to hear a rumor that would destroy him. But that part of the story was still hours away. For now, Cleopatra sat in silence, surrounded by everything she had ever owned, and listened to the footsteps of Roman soldiers growing closer. She had made her choice. The doors were locked. The treasure was safe. And Octavian would have to come to her, not the other way around. The stage was set. The audience was watching. And the queen was ready for her final act. Cleopatra sat inside her mausoleum, surrounded by gold and silence, while outside the rumor began its work. It did not start with a shouted announcement or an official messenger. It started the way most disasters start in history, with someone seeing something and someone else misunderstanding everything. A servant looked up at the sealed doors of the tomb and whispered to another servant that the queen had locked herself inside. That much was true. But then the second servant told the guard that the queen had locked herself inside and refused to come out. Also true. Then the guard told a soldier that the queen had locked herself inside and looked like she was never coming out. Still technically true. But by the time the soldier told an officer that the queen had locked herself inside because she was preparing for death, the truth had already begun to rot. Within hours, the palace was buzzing with something far more dangerous than facts. It was buzzing with a version of facts that people wanted to believe. Alexandria had spent weeks holding its breath, waiting for Octavian to arrive. Every merchant in the market knew the Romans were coming. Every sailor in the port knew the fleet had been destroyed. Every noble in the palace knew that Cleopatra had lost. And when people are already certain the disaster is coming, they do not need evidence. They need confirmation. The rumor became confirmation. Someone said they had seen Cleopatra's attendants weeping inside the mausoleum. Someone else said they had heard wailing from behind the stone doors. A third person claimed that a physician had been summoned and then sent away, which meant nothing was working, which meant the queen was already gone. None of these people had actually seen anything. But fear is a terrible historian. It fills in every blank with the worst possible answer. And the worst possible answer was spreading through Alexandria like fire through dry grain. By midday, the rumor had evolved into something almost unrecognizable. The queen was dead. Not dying. Not preparing to die. Dead. Someone had actually said those words, and once they were spoken, they could not be taken back. A merchant in the market told a customer that the queen had taken poison. The customer told a sailor. The sailor told a soldier. And the soldier told everyone who would listen that Cleopatra of Egypt had chosen death over capture. The story was clean. It was dramatic. It was exactly what everyone expected to happen. And it was completely false. But here is where the story takes its strangest turn. The rumor did not just spread through the streets of Alexandria. It spread through the palace corridors. It climbed the stairs to the rooms where Mark Antony was trying to figure out how to save himself from total ruin. And Antony heard the rumor the same way everyone else heard it, not from a trusted messenger, not from Cleopatra herself, not from any official source, but from the anxious whispers of people who had heard it from other people who had heard it from other people. He should have asked for proof. He should have sent a runner to the mausoleum. He should have done what any general would do before acting on life-changing information. He did none of those things. Instead, Antony accepted the story immediately. There is something heartbreaking and pathetic about that moment. Here was a man who had commanded armies, who had fought alongside Julius Caesar, who had ruled half the Roman world. And in his final days, he did not fall because of a betrayal or a battle or a brilliant enemy strategy. He fell because he heard a rumor and believed it without question. Why did he believe it so easily? Perhaps he was exhausted. Perhaps he was already defeated and looking for an excuse to stop fighting. Perhaps deep down, he wanted the story to be true because it meant his own suffering would end. Perhaps he simply could not imagine a world where Cleopatra was still alive and he was still losing. Whatever the reason, Antony accepted the death of Cleopatra the way a drowning man accepts the water, without resistance, without verification, without a single moment of doubt. He looked at the faces around him, saw their fear and sadness, and decided that the worst possible news must be true because that was the kind of world he was living in now. A world where he had lost everything. A world where his lover was gone. A world where the future belonged to Octavian. Antony did not realize that the rumor was wrong. He did not know that Cleopatra was still breathing, still thinking, still waiting inside her stone chamber. He did not understand that he was about to make a decision based on nothing but the anxious whispers of frightened servants. And that decision would be final. The mausoleum stood silent. The rumor spread faster than any messenger could run. And somewhere inside the palace, Mark Antony began to say goodbye to a woman who was very much alive. The tragedy had not even started, and already everyone involved was failing to communicate. A locked door, a misunderstanding, a queen who did not know what her lover was planning, and a lover who did not bother to check if his queen was breathing. History has seen more dignified endings, but few have been so completely and tragically avoidable. The rumor reached Mark Antony, and in that moment something inside him simply stopped. He did not scream. He did not rage against the gods or call for Octavian's head. He just sat there surrounded by the wreckage of his life and accepted the news the way a man accepts a death sentence when he has already been waiting for it for weeks. His armies were gone. His allies had abandoned him. His ships lay at the bottom of the sea near Actium. And now Cleopatra, the woman for whom he had thrown away his reputation, his command, and his future, was dead. It made a terrible kind of sense. Of course she was dead. Everyone else had already left him. Why would she be any different? What happened next has been debated by historians for 2,000 years because it is almost too strange to believe. Antony called for a servant, one of his most trusted attendants, and gave an order that should have been simple. Help me end this. The servant looked at the man who had once commanded Roman legions, who had feasted with queens, who had slept in the tents of warriors, and something in the servant's face changed. Perhaps he saw the ruin in Antony's eyes. Perhaps he realized that his master was no longer thinking clearly. Perhaps he simply decided that he had reached his limit for strange requests. Whatever went through his mind, the servant did something unexpected. He drew his own blade and killed himself right there in front of Antony. One moment he was standing, the next moment he was not. The blood pooled on the floor, and Antony stared at the body of a man who had just completed a task meant for someone else. This was not the intended outcome. Imagine the silence that followed. Antony alone now in a room with a dead servant who had somehow managed to die faster and more efficiently than his own master. The absurdity of the moment must have been almost unbearable. Here was one of the greatest military commanders of the ancient world outdone in suicide by his own assistant. There was no poetry in it, no drama, just a bleeding servant, a confused general, and the growing realization that nothing was going according to plan. But Antony was not a man who gave up easily, even when giving up was exactly what he was trying to do. He took the blade himself, and he stabbed his own body. The wound was serious, but it was not clean. Ancient writers describe what happened next in language that suggests embarrassment more than tragedy. Antony did not die. He fell to the floor bleeding and broken, but very much alive. The blade had not found its mark. The hand that had once held a sword steady in battle had trembled at the last second. And now he lay there in agony, waiting for death to arrive, while death seemed to be taking its time. The room grew quiet. The servant's body grew cold. And Antony began to realize something terrible. He was still breathing. He was still thinking. He was still trapped in a body that refused to let go. Outside the palace, the world continued moving. Messengers ran through corridors. Guards changed their posts. The sun moved across the sky, indifferent to the suffering of Roman generals. And then a new voice arrived. A messenger, breathless and wide-eyed, pushed through the doors and delivered words that would have been funny if they were not so devastating. Cleopatra is alive. She was never dead. She is inside the mausoleum. The rumor was wrong. Antony lifted his head from the floor and looked at the messenger with eyes that had already accepted death. The confusion must have been overwhelming. He had just killed himself because of a lie. His servant was dead because of a lie. His blood was pooling on the stones because of a lie. And now someone was telling him that Cleopatra, the woman he had mourned, the woman he had followed and to ruin, the woman he had just tried to join in death, was sitting in her tomb, perfectly alive, completely unaware that any of this had happened. The irony was almost too sharp to survive. Antony had not been betrayed by Octavian's armies or outmaneuvered by Roman politics. He had been betrayed by a rumor, a whisper, a misunderstanding that spread through Alexandria like a sickness. And now he was dying for real, but slowly, awkwardly, painfully in a way that no poet would ever want to describe. This was not the death of a hero. This was the death of a man who believed what he heard without asking if it was true. He had one request left. Take me to her. Let me see her one more time before I go. The attendants looked at each other. They looked at his wound. They looked at the servant's body on the floor. And then they began to carry him through the palace toward the mausoleum where Cleopatra sat waiting for news that had not yet arrived. She did not know that Antony was bleeding. She did not know that he had tried to die. She did not know that the rumor had already changed everything. The doors of the mausoleum were still sealed. The queen was still inside, and one of Rome's greatest generals was being carried through Alexandria to meet a woman who had no idea that he had already said goodbye. The attendants carried Mark Antony through the palace corridors while blood dripped onto the stone floors and pooled in the cracks between ancient tiles. His body was heavy. His breathing was shallow. Every step sent a new wave of pain through his wound, and yet he kept whispering the same words over and over. Take me to her. Take me to Cleopatra. The servants who had once watched him command armies now watched him struggle to stay conscious. They did not know if he would survive the journey. They did not even know if he would survive the next few minutes. But they kept walking because what else could they do? Their general was dying in their arms, and the woman he loved was locked inside a tomb that refused to open. When they finally reached the mausoleum, the scene that awaited them was almost comical in its absurdity. The great stone doors stood sealed exactly as Cleopatra had commanded. Guards stood outside looking confused and uncertain. The attendants called up to the windows shouting that Mark Antony was wounded, that he was dying, that he needed to see the queen immediately. From inside the mausoleum came a woman's voice. Not Cleopatra's, but one of her trusted companions. The doors cannot be opened. The queen has sealed them from within. No one enters. No one leaves. The men outside stared at each other in disbelief. Antony was bleeding out in their arms, and someone was telling them that a locked door was more important than saving a Roman general's life. They shouted again, explaining the urgency, explaining that Antony had already wounded himself, explaining that he did not have much time left. The answer from inside was the same. The doors cannot be opened. But there was a pause after the words this time. A hesitation. Then the voice returned with a suggestion that would have sounded insane under any other circumstances. The windows. Use the windows. We will lower ropes. Imagine the scene that followed. A group of exhausted men carrying a dying general. A group of women inside a stone tomb preparing ropes. And between them, a second-story window that had never been designed for hauling wounded soldiers. The attendants inside the mausoleum found whatever rope and fabric they could gather. They tied it together quickly, desperately. Then they lowered it from the window while the men outside tried to figure out how to attach a bleeding Roman general to the end of it. Antony was not a small man. He had spent his life eating well and commanding armies and enjoying the privileges of power. His body was solid. His armor was heavy. His wound was still bleeding. And now a handful of women were supposed to pull him up through a window because nobody could figure out how to unlock a door. The attempt began badly, and it did not improve. The ropes creaked under Antony's weight. The women pulled with everything they had while their hands slipped and their footing gave way. Ancient writers specifically mention that Cleopatra herself joined the effort. The queen of Egypt, the last pharaoh of a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries, stood at a window, pulling ropes with her own hands while her lover dangled in the air below her. Her attendants gasped and strained beside her. Servants inside the mausoleum shouted encouragement or possibly prayers. No one was sure anymore what was happening. This was not how queens were supposed to behave. This was not how generals were supposed to die. And yet here they were engaged in the most undignified rescue mission in ancient history. Antony swayed as he was lifted. His wound opened further. Blood dripped onto the stones beneath him. Below the window, the men who had carried him watched helplessly, unable to climb up and unable to help. Above him, the women pulled and pulled and pulled until finally his fingers caught the edge of the window frame. Then his arms, then his shoulders. Then, with one final desperate heave, his body tumbled over the sill and into the arms of Cleopatra's attendants. He was inside, barely, bleeding, broken, but inside. The queen rushed to his side, and what happened between them in that moment has been described by historians with a mixture of respect and embarrassment. There were tears. There were whispers. There was the kind of intimacy that only comes when two people know that they're saying goodbye forever. Cleopatra held Antony's head in her lap and listened as he tried to explain what had happened. The rumor, the false report, the servant who had killed himself first, the blade that had missed its mark, the long, slow realization that he had thrown everything away because he believed a lie. She did not interrupt. She did not tell him that she had been alive the whole time. She just held him and listened while his voice grew weaker and his breathing grew shallower. Outside the mausoleum, Octavian's soldiers were already securing the city. Inside, a dying general lay in the arms of a defeated queen. The doors were still sealed. The treasure was still piled against the walls. And somewhere in the distance, the future emperor of Rome was beginning to realize that the most valuable prize of his conquest might already be slipping through his fingers. But that realization was still hours away. For now, there was only this: a room full of gold, a woman covered in blood, and a man taking his last breath in the arms of the woman he had ruined everything to love. Mark Antony died in Cleopatra's arms inside a sealed tomb, surrounded by the gold of a dying dynasty. His last breath came quietly, without speeches, without glory, without any of the drama that poets would later invent for him. One moment he was there, the next moment he was gone, and Cleopatra was alone. Not literally alone, of course. Her attendants still stood in the shadows of the mausoleum. The treasure still gleamed in the flickering lamplight. The doors were still locked. But politically, emotionally, strategically, she was now the last person standing in a story that had already been written by someone else. Octavian held the pen. Octavian controlled the ending. Or so he believed. The queen did not weep for long. Ancient writers note something remarkable about Cleopatra's behavior in the hours after Antony's death. She did not collapse. She did not rage. She did not make desperate plans to escape or bargain for her life. Instead, she became calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that should have worried everyone around her, because it was the calm of someone who had already accepted something terrible. She washed Antony's body with her own hands. She spoke to him in a voice so low that her attendants could not hear the words. She arranged his hair and closed his eyes and kissed his forehead with a tenderness that seemed almost out of place in a room filled with stolen treasure and Roman soldiers waiting outside the door. Then she stood up. The transformation was immediate. The grieving woman disappeared and the queen returned. She gave orders to her attendants. Send word to Octavian that Mark Antony is dead. Tell him that I am inside the mausoleum. Tell him that the treasure is here with me. And tell him that I am willing to negotiate. The messengers left through the same window that had been used to haul Antony's body inside. They ran through the streets of Alexandria, carrying news that would change the balance of power between the woman in the tomb and the man who wanted to own her. Octavian received the message with mixed emotions. On one hand, his greatest rival was dead. Antony would never challenge him again. The civil war was finally over. On the other hand, Cleopatra was still alive and still in control of the treasure and still locked inside a building that he could not enter without her cooperation. She had turned her tomb into a fortress and her fortress into a bargaining table. Octavian could conquer Egypt, but he could not force her to open those doors. He could surround the mausoleum with soldiers, but he could not stop her from destroying every piece of gold inside. And he could certainly not stop her from killing herself before he ever got his hands on her. This was the strange dance that followed. Messengers traveled back and forth between the Roman camp and the sealed mausoleum. Octavian made promises. Cleopatra listened. Octavian offered assurances. Cleopatra considered them. Octavian suggested that she would be treated well, that her children would be spared, that she might even be allowed to live in comfort somewhere far from Rome. Cleopatra nodded and smiled and asked questions and made requests and pretended to believe that any of his promises were worth the breath used to speak them. She knew what Octavian really wanted. He wanted her alive. He wanted her treasure. He wanted to parade her through the streets of Rome in chains while the crowds cheered his victory. She would become his trophy, his proof that he had conquered not just Egypt, but the last link to Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and the old republic that he was destroying piece by piece. The negotiations dragged on for days. Octavian grew impatient. Cleopatra grew more calm. He sent his own officers to speak with her, directly hoping that a personal meeting might break the deadlock. She received them politely dressed in her finest clothing, surrounded by the wealth of her ancestors. The officers reported back to Octavian that the queen was composed, intelligent, and completely unafraid. This worried him more than any threat or outburst would have. A woman who is afraid can be controlled. A woman who is calm has already decided something that she is not telling you. What Cleopatra had decided was simple. She would not go to Rome. She would not walk in Octavian's triumph. She would not become a footnote in his victory speech. If she could not live as a queen, she would die as one. But she did not announce this decision. She kept it hidden behind her calm smile and her careful words and her willingness to negotiate. Octavian thought he was winning. He thought time was on his side. He thought that eventually Cleopatra would accept reality and open those doors and let him take her to Rome, where he would display her like a captured animal. He was wrong. The queen was not negotiating. She was waiting. And while she waited, she began to prepare for something that Octavian had not anticipated. She began to arrange her own death. Not in panic, not in despair, but with the same careful, deliberate intelligence that had kept her on the throne for 2 decades. The doors stayed locked. The treasure stayed safe. And Cleopatra stayed calm. Too calm. The calm before an ending that no one saw coming. The days inside the mausoleum blurred together. Cleopatra ate little. She slept less. And she spent long hours sitting among her treasure, writing letters that would never be sent and speaking to attendants who could not meet her eyes. Octavian's messengers came and went with the same empty promises. Surrender, and you'll be treated well. Come to Rome, and your children will be safe. Open these doors, and we can end this peacefully. The queen listened to every word, and then she did nothing. She was waiting, not for Octavian to change his mind, not for a miracle that would save her kingdom. She was waiting for the courage to do what she had already decided must be done. The method of her death has been argued about for 2,000 years. Some ancient writers insist that an ASP was smuggled into the mausoleum, hidden among a basket of figs. Others claim that she used poison concealed in a hollow hairpin. A few suggest that she applied a deadly ointment to her skin and let it seep into her blood. The truth is that nobody knows. Octavian's own historians wrote conflicting accounts because they were not there and because admitting that a woman had outsmarted the future emperor of Rome was embarrassing for everyone involved. But one detail appears in almost every version of the story. Cleopatra died deliberately, not in panic, not in desperation. She died the way she had lived, on her own terms. What happened in those final hours has the strange quality of a dream. Cleopatra reportedly bathed and dressed in her finest robes. She ate a meal with her attendants and spoke to them about ordinary things. The weather, the city, the future that they would have after she was gone. None of them understood what was happening because she did not want them to understand. She wanted them to remember her calm. She wanted them to remember her beautiful. She wanted them to remember her as a queen, not as a prisoner being led to a Roman jail. Then she sent a letter to Octavian. The contents were simple. She asked to be buried beside Mark Antony. Nothing more. No threats. No demands. No last-minute attempts to bargain for her life. Octavian received the letter and immediately understood what it meant. A woman does not request burial arrangements unless she has already decided that she will not need a living one. He shouted orders. Guards ran toward the mausoleum. Messengers were dispatched with instructions to break down the doors if necessary. The future emperor of Rome moved with a speed that he had not shown in weeks because he finally realized that he had been outmaneuvered. Cleopatra had not been negotiating. She had been buying time, and now time had run out. The Roman guards reached the mausoleum and found the doors still sealed. They shouted up to the windows, demanding entry. There was no response. They shouted again. Still nothing. Finally, they broke through the doors using whatever tools they could find and rushed inside. The scene that greeted them was silent and strange. The treasures still gleamed against the walls. The oil lamps still flickered in the dim stone chambers. And Cleopatra lay on a golden couch, dressed in her finest clothing with her attendants dying around her. One version of the story says that the ASP was never found. Another claims that a small snake was discovered hidden among the figs. A third insists that Cleopatra's body showed no marks at all, suggesting that she had used a poison so subtle that it left no trace. The Roman guards stood in confusion. They had been sent to capture a living queen. Instead, they found a woman who had already escaped them. Octavian arrived shortly after and looked down at the body of his greatest trophy, the woman he had planned to parade through Rome, the queen he had intended to display in chains, the living symbol of his victory over Egypt and Antony and everything that had come before. She was gone. He had conquered her kingdom. He had defeated her armies. He had taken everything from her. But he had not taken her. She had given herself away in the only way that still belonged to her. What happened next is almost painful to imagine. Octavian ordered physicians to try and revive her. He sent for antidotes and treatments that arrived too late. He stood in the mausoleum surrounded by gold and death and the wreckage of his perfect victory. He had planned everything carefully. Every detail, every negotiation, every promise and threat had been designed to bring Cleopatra to Rome alive. And now she lay on a couch with her attendants scattered around her, and a smile that some writers described as peaceful and others described as victorious. She had done it. She had written the final chapter herself, and Octavian could only stand there and watch as the last of his prizes slipped through his fingers. The Queen of Egypt was gone, but she had left behind something more valuable than treasure. She had left behind a story about a woman who refused to be displayed, a woman who chose death over humiliation, a woman who looked at the future emperor of Rome and said, "Not today, not ever." And then she closed her eyes and went to meet Mark Antony in whatever comes after. The doors of the mausoleum stood open now. The treasure was finally within Octavian's reach. But the one thing he had wanted most was already beyond his grasp. Cleopatra had denied him the ending he wanted, and that denial would echo through history for 2,000 years. Because nobody remembers how Octavian celebrated his victory. Everyone remembers how Cleopatra refused to be part of it.